My husband and I are both 30 years old, and we've been married for 8 wonderful years. Before that, we spent 2 beautiful years dating, truly getting to know each other, and in those years, it felt like we had built something unshakable. Now, I'm currently on maternity leave, taking care of our 8-month-old son. Life has shifted in ways I never imagined, but for the longest time, we shared something that felt effortless, full of joy and companionship. Our relationship was the kind that many people would look at and feel envious of. It was almost as if we had figured out the secret to being truly happy together. We were completely in sync, and after many conversations, we came to an agreement that having children wasn't necessary for us to feel fulfilled. At that time, we were happy just being the two of us, exploring the world together, sharing our dreams, and growing closer with every step. But over time, something changed gradually, subtly, but unmistakably. It was my husband who began to shift his perspective first. I noticed it in the little ways at first, how he would light up around children, how his voice would soften when we saw families out together. He was always wonderful with kids, but it wasn't until he sat me down and told me how he felt that I realized how much he wanted to become a father. He had changed his mind about something we once thought was set in stone, and his desire to have a child grew stronger with each passing day. At first, I wasn't sure how to feel. It took me some time to adjust to this new idea, but eventually, I saw how much it meant to him. And when I finally told him I was pregnant, the joy on his face was beyond words. His excitement was palpable, and when we found out it would be a boy, it was as if his entire world lit up with a new kind of happiness. I always thought of him as the most dependable person in my life, a rock I could lean on, someone I trusted with all my heart. It never once crossed my mind that he could turn his back on me and our child so easily, exchanging everything we built for another woman. And after so many years of happiness together, the shift in our relationship was sudden and brutal, catching me completely off guard. It felt as though overnight, my husband had been replaced by someone I no longer recognized. He became irritable, distant, and inattentive. His once warm, caring nature toward me and our child seemed to vanish without a trace. Whenever I asked him to spend time with the baby, he brushed it off, citing work stress and constant exhaustion as excuses. But it wasn't just his absence from our child's life that hurt. What was even more painful was the way he had disconnected from me. The intimacy that had once bound us together like glue had vanished into thin air. He stopped touching me, stopped looking at me with that spark of love that had always been there. It was as though the man who once shared my bed, my hopes, and my future had turned into a stranger. He had become a shadow of the person I had fallen in love with, a man who was once tender and thoughtful, but now distant and cold, almost as if we had never shared all those years together. And so, there I was, standing alone in the ruins of what was once a vibrant, passionate relationship, wondering how on earth it had come to this. How could the person I trusted with my whole soul, the father of my child, suddenly seem like someone I didn't know at all? I fought with all my might to push away the haunting thought of infidelity, convincing myself that such a betrayal could never happen to me, not from him. How could it? We had shared too much, gone through too many trials, and built a family together. I clung to the belief that whatever distance had grown between us, it was temporary, that it would pass, like a fleeting storm. But the tension lingered, and instead of seeing the light at the end of this dark tunnel, things only got worse. For months, we drifted further apart, and I could feel something was terribly wrong, though I tried to deny it to myself. Then, one evening, his words came crashing down like an avalanche. He confessed there was another woman, someone who had stolen his heart in a way that left me devastated. He didn't just like her, he loved her. But what broke me even more was that despite this confession, he had no intention of leaving our family. He said he couldn't abandon our son, couldn't walk away from the life we had built together. I was shattered. My mind spiraled between disbelief and heartbreak. How could the man I had trusted, who had been my partner through all of life's ups and downs, have fallen for someone else? It felt like the foundation of my world had crumbled beneath my feet. But despite the immense pain, I found myself agreeing to stay. I hoped, perhaps naively, that this new relationship of his was just a fleeting infatuation, that he would come to his senses and realize what we had was worth fighting for. I told myself that if I held on, if I forgave him and gave him space, he might let go of this other woman and return to us, return to the family we had lovingly created around our son, our long-awaited child. Day after day, I lived in limbo, torn between the anguish of betrayal and the deep, desperate hope that he would change his mind. I waited, praying for the day he would realize what he was throwing away and come back to me, fully, without hesitation. After all, we had a future, a son who needed his father, and I was willing to endure this heartbreak if it meant saving our family. For 2 long, agonizing months, we lived separately. The silence between us spoke louder than any words ever could. I hoped, prayed even, that he would come to his senses. And eventually, he did return to the family, claiming that his relationship with her was over. He stood before me, before my parents, and made promises that sounded almost too good to be true. He vowed that there would be no more lies, no more infidelity, that he was ready to rebuild what we once had. I took him back, not because I had fully forgiven him or because I had forgotten the pain, but for the sake of our son. I thought about the future and convinced myself that our child needed his father, a stable family, more than I needed my own peace of mind. But things didn't get better. He didn't return to me with love or warmth. Instead, it felt as though I was living with a stranger, someone who shared the same face and voice but had lost all connection to me. The man I once adored, trusted with all my heart, was now distant, cold, and indifferent. We existed in the same space, but we were worlds apart emotionally. Then, as if the knife wasn't already lodged deep enough, I learned the awful truth: the affair wasn't over. He had lied, once again. His relationship with her continued behind my back, like a shadow lurking in the corners of my life. And why had he returned? Not out of regret, not out of love for me or our son, but because she, his lover, was married and wasn't planning to leave her husband. She had her own family, 2 children, and her own life that she wasn't willing to disrupt for him. She was 5 years older than him, more experienced, and they worked together, making it easy for them to continue their secret life. And so, he came crawling back, not out of desire to fix what was broken between us, but to maintain the facade of a family man. I was shattered. How could I live this way? Sharing the man I loved, knowing that his heart belonged to someone else, pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't? The thought of enduring this torment, of pretending, of keeping silent in the face of betrayal, was unbearable. I couldn't do it anymore. I filed for divorce. It was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. Every fiber of my being ached because despite it all, I still loved him. I loved the man I once knew, but I had to face the harsh reality: he was no longer that man. The person I had fallen in love with no longer existed, and what remained was someone who didn't need me, didn't care for me the way I deserved. Upon learning that I had filed for divorce, my husband began his desperate attempts to win me back. He claimed he was suffering without us, that life had become unbearable, and that his feelings for the other woman had faded. He assured me that it was all a mistake, that what he felt for her wasn't real, and that he just needed some time to fully end things with her. Yet, as much as his words should have brought me comfort, I found myself unable to believe them. It all felt like just another excuse, a new lie to keep me tied to him while he continued living a double life. He promised me change, but I could see it in his eyes: it wasn't sincere. His behavior towards me hadn't improved in the slightest. He was as distant as ever, cold and indifferent. He barely looked at me the way he used to, as though I was invisible in my own home. And though he had become a bit more attentive to our child, I knew it was only because he thought it might soften me, make me more forgiving. But there was no true affection in his actions, no real desire to fix what he had broken between us. In every word, every glance, every unspoken moment, I could feel that his heart wasn't here. His mind, his body, his very essence, it was still with her. He might have said all the right things, might have made promises to change, but I wasn't blind to the reality. His soul was no longer with me, and I couldn't continue pretending that things could ever go back to the way they were. I gave him one final, non-negotiable condition: he needed to quit his job and cut off all contact with her. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about trust, about rebuilding what had been broken, and I simply couldn't see how that would be possible if they continued to work together. Every single day at the office with her would be a constant temptation, a reminder of what had happened. How could he look me in the eye and claim he wanted to fix things, yet refuse to take the most basic step toward ensuring that our relationship had a chance to heal? But of course, he refused. His response was the same as always: the job was too good to leave, and finding something similar would be nearly impossible. He played the financial card, reminding me that since I was still on maternity leave and not earning an income, things would be difficult without his salary. He almost seemed to assume I was trapped, that I had no choice but to accept things as they were, because how else would I get by? But what he didn't understand, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that I wasn't as alone as he thought. My parents were fully behind me on this. They had seen enough, heard enough, and were absolutely set on helping me through this. They were encouraging me to leave, to free myself from this emotional torture. For me, the issue was crystal clear. He had to change his work environment. No man could stand beside his lover every day and truly let go of the past. I laid it out for him. If he didn't quit, we would get divorced. It was as simple as that. He needed to choose. Either he was all in, or this marriage was over. I was done with the lies, the half-truths, and the endless cycle of hope and disappointment. I refused to live in a love triangle any longer. If he couldn't make a decision, then I would make it for him. Days passed, and the tension between us remained thick and suffocating, like an unspoken storm hanging over our home. Every conversation felt like a battlefield, where neither of us truly wanted to confront the deeper issues, but couldn't help the passive-aggressive remarks that chipped away at whatever remained of our bond. I kept reminding him about my ultimatum: quit the job or end the sham of a marriage, but every time, he had another excuse. Either the job was too lucrative to leave, or he'd claimed that quitting wouldn't solve our real problems, that I was just using it as an excuse to cover up bigger issues. In his eyes, he was the rational one, holding on to logic and practicality, while I was just emotional, unreasonable. It was infuriating. The nights were the hardest. We'd lie there in silence, his body turned away from me, and I would stare at the ceiling, my mind running in circles. Part of me still wanted to believe him, to believe that maybe he could change, that maybe this was just a phase. But deep down, I knew the truth. I knew that every time he walked into that office and saw her, the same cycle would repeat itself. He might say the right words, make the right promises, but his actions always betrayed him. There was no future for us as long as he stayed there, orbiting around her life while I stood on the sidelines, waiting for crumbs of affection. One day, I realized that I couldn't live like this anymore. I had tried to forgive, tried to forget, tried to believe that love would conquer all. But the cracks in our marriage had grown too wide, too deep to be mended. I wasn't just losing him, I had already lost him, and what was left was merely the shell of a relationship, a hollow echo of what once was. The day I saw the resignation in his eyes, the subtle way he shrugged off my pleas, I knew it was over. He had made his choice without even realizing it, and it wasn't me. The following week, I filed for divorce. The legal process felt strangely mechanical, as if my emotions had gone numb, leaving only a cold, detached sense of finality. I had cried so much over the past months that I didn't have any tears left. Now, it was just about surviving, about moving forward for the sake of my son, for the sake of my own sanity. My parents stood by me every step of the way, offering their support, their love. And while the pain was still there, raw, sharp, always present, I began to feel lighter. As if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, one that I had carried for far too long. In the end, the love I once had for him had transformed into something else. It wasn't hatred, and it wasn't indifference either. It was a quiet acceptance of the fact that people change, and sometimes, no matter how much you fight for someone, you can't make them choose you. He had his path, and I had mine, and though they had once run side by side, they were now irreversibly diverging. The last conversation we had was brief, almost clinical. He asked about the divorce proceedings, mentioned a few logistical things about the house and our son. And then, before he hung up, he said something that struck me in a way I didn't expect. "I never meant to hurt you," he said softly, as if those words could somehow erase the months of pain, the betrayals, the sleepless nights. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. As I stood there, phone still in hand, I realized that this was the closure I needed. Not his apology, not his words, but the simple truth that I had fought for my happiness, for my dignity, and had come out the other side stronger, even if scarred. Life would move on, and so would I. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I would never again allow myself to be second to someone who couldn't even choose me first.